about the judgment being exercised by those individuals. We make examples in the regs of people who do merely administrative functions, or who may do intake and may do an interview with the client and put some stuff in, and then hand the form off, the return off to a paraprofessional or to a CPA or to whomever. That merely clerical function does not make you a return preparer. It really goes to this judgment test, all or substantially all of the return. Unpaid interns, if they are actually doing all or substantially all of the return, and the firm is charging money for the return, regardless of whether they're paying the intern, are covered if they're doing all or substantially all of the return. That's where the distinction is. It's not about whether how they're being compensated. It's what their contributions are to the tax return.
Penalties associated if you do end up catching somebody?
So I was asked about penalties and what we're going to do about them. As I think all of you know, there's an existing penalty regime in the law. We're actually taking a look at that, both as to the kinds of penalties we have and also to the size. I've actually heard from a number of folks, CPAs and others, who say, you know, your penalties, even when you do assess them, they're not really a sting. They're more of a minor irritant. They really don't get folks' attention. And we're not looking to jack up penalties to make money, but we are looking to use penalties as a tool to improve behavior. And there is nothing like a significant penalty that actually creates a buzz in the community about the risk, if you will, of not complying. And for folks who are out there sort of doing a risk-reward analysis right now, we may have to adjust the penalties so that that equation tilts in the favor of complying with the rules rather than avoiding and hiding. More on that later. If folks are thinking I can spell it out now, I can't. It's going to take us some time.
Will auditors have access to answers given in the P10 application?
Will auditors, I was just asked, will auditors have access for the to the information provided in the P10 application? If you're referring to folks who are auditing an individual's return, so if you are a preparer and you're under audit as an individual, regardless of your tax professional status, probably not. The focus will be on the facts and circumstances attendant to your return. If you are a return preparer who's contacted by a field agent who's there to look at you as a tax return professional, the answer will be yes. They'll be looking at your fitness to practice. They're there to look at how you are preparing a large number of returns and whether they comply with the rules and so on. So it will depend on the circumstances. But we aren't going to be sending folks to audit your individual tax return because you're a return preparer. It will be selected, again, as I talked earlier about the distinction between e-filed and paper returns, it will be selected based on the characteristics on the return, not on your professional status.
Does your answer to the question about 940, 941 also apply to 990s?
The question was whether or my answer about 940 and 941s attaches to 990s. It attaches to anything that isn't part of the 1040 family today, meaning that we still haven't worked it out, but to the extent that there are other forms for which we don't have tests today, it is unlikely that anything other than obtaining a P10 will be part of the requirement, at least initially. If we decide that we see, you know, this really boils down to a business case. It's looking at as we gain more information, what kinds of problems are we seeing? What kinds of returns are they associated with it? What kinds of P10s are associated with it? And do we have testing requirements, or should we? So it would really depend on whether we saw significant problems with 990s that we weren't addressing in some other way as to whether or not we might extend additional requirements through the return preparer regime that I've been describing. And we don't have that information, so it'll take us some time before we get there.
And somebody's asking specifically about their outsourced preparers in India. Whether, I think you covered a little bit about folks overseas.
So I was asked about someone's outsourced workers in India. I don't really know anything about your outsourced workers in India. You'll have to give me a little more information.
Make sure that the individuals in India are registered.
All right, so the question was, do we need to make sure that the individuals in India are registered? So again, what's the test? Do they prepare all or substantially all of the tax return? If in fact folks in India are making judgments about that return in a substantial way, the answer is yes. And they will be able, by the way, to take the test. And so I skipped over this one because I wanted to get to some of the questions. But let me just describe a little bit about the testing so you'll understand it. We intend to work with a vendor. There is one who does the EA exam, the Enrolled Agent exam today, but there are a number out there who will provide multiple national and international locations where people may come in and take the test. We will allow them access to our forms and our ever so brilliantly written instructions, but we won't allow them access to, and this is really what's going to matter, is tax software. All right, so the individuals will not be able to use a tool that they may use in the office because what we're after is making sure they understand the outcomes on the return. They'll need to be able to explain why that taxpayer is not entitled to as large an earned income credit as he or she may have anticipated, or why the taxpayer is subject to the alternative minimum tax, and perhaps a little bit about how one arrived at that conclusion. Again, we're looking at minimal competency. We're not trying to scare people off, but what we're trying to get at is, do they intellectually understand how they got to the answer they got to? So folks in India, absolutely. We've heard from, actually from the AICPA about a model of overseas preparers who do returns for expats. They're not in India, they're in London or wherever they are. They're also covered to the extent that they are doing all or substantially all of the return.
And are the forms going to be modified to list multiple PTINs?
All right, so I was asked whether multiple PTINs would appear on the form so that you have multiple signatures, and this goes to the administrability that I described earlier. The answer is no. We will focus on the person who signed the return, and if there are problems with enough returns that we're going to talk to that individual, then we will ask him or her who else contributed and what other PTINs were involved in that. So it won't require us changing the forms or you to add lots of them, but it will mean that on complex returns where there are a lot of people kicking in, you may very well want to keep track if you have any concerns that will be asking questions about the returns.
Okay, we got about 10 minutes left.
All right.
Okay. Have the IRS made an estimate of how much more taxpayers will be paying as a result of this change? And if so,
so the question was whether the IRS has made any estimates about how much more taxpayers will be paying as a result of this change. First of all, I would reject the premise. It's unclear to me that more accurate return preparation means higher taxes. Frankly, having seen the quality of some of the returns that we receive, my concern is that sometimes taxpayers are leaving money on the table because the person doing the return didn't have two clues to rub together. And I say that a little pointedly because I want folks to understand this has nothing to do with us trying to raise more money. And in fact, we are covering people under the Circular 230 regime and redefining representation before the IRS to include return preparation, meaning that people who are preparing returns are to be representing their clients, the taxpayers. So as far as I'm concerned, I would expect more accurate tax returns, not necessarily more productive ones from a revenue standpoint.
Can taxpayers still send in paper checks after 12/31, or does the e-pay mandate only apply to payroll tax returns?
I don't think I talked about an e-pay mandate, except I didn't talk. The e-file mandate is not an e-pay mandate; it's an e-file mandate. Taxpayers may continue to pay by paper, but do be mindful of the deadlines because those do need to clear in the appropriate amount of time.
I have a question. This may be asking you to state the obvious, but we like clarification. When you were talking about the 15 hours of continuing education, you were very clear about 3 hours that apply to tax law, 2 hours that apply to ethics. Is that ethics as it relates to taxes or any ethics?
So I don't have to repeat this, right?
And then, no, because I'm by the
You're at
mic. So, and then the last part, the 10 hours of buyer's choice, is that tax-related buyer's choice?
All right, so recall earlier that I was talking about, we want to make sure that the continuing education requirements are approved by the IRS, right? So We may look at leveraging models where there's already approval and maybe accept those. I don't know yet. But the bottom line is they need to be focused, they need to be approved by us. So the ethics training needs to focus on the kinds of things that one does as a return preparer, not